Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Think with ABD podcast, a podcast about almost anything at the intersection of analytics, digital, and design. I'm your host today, Michelle. According to Bloomberg's reports, pandemic-induced burnout is on the rise, fueled by a combination of confinements, greater family responsibilities, and longer working hours. In a post-COVID-19 world, companies are becoming more precautious in managing budgets, streamlining operations, and eliminating redundancies. So, what does it mean to a team lead who is still responsible for innovations? Can our virtual brainstorming section be equally as effective as those in person ones? In today's podcast, I have invited a good friend of mine, Kareen Proudian. Kareen Proudian is a managing partner at Faculty of Change, a strategic innovation consultancy in Toronto. Kareen has more than a decade of experience working with different companies across financial services, healthcare, and not-for-profit. Welcome, Kareen.
Hi, thank you so much, Michelle.
Well, to kick it off, maybe you can kind of educate us on what Faculty of Change is and what's your role there.
Of course, sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks again for having me. So Faculty of Change is a strategic innovation consultancy. And really what that means is between myself and my two business partners, Jared and Dylan, we work to help our clients understand the changes that are happening around them and help them create opportunities out of that change. And so really it's about using our discipline, using our capabilities to help them kind of uncover the root of change or the challenges that changes bring about and turning those into strategic opportunities for better serving their clients, better serving their constituents, better serving their patients, depending, of course, on the industry.
Makes sense. So I remember, I guess in recent months, Faculty of Change had published a series of articles on the topic like how people can cope with uncertainties. And I know you also has been working with a lot of organizations during the transition. So can you describe to us a few key trends you have observed so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if it's okay, maybe before I do that, I
Mhm.
can speak about sort of the discipline that we use to understand uncertainty, if you will.
Absolutely.
Sure. So we use a discipline called strategic foresight, and we have a lot of experts in that discipline that are working with that are members of the Faculty of Change, and really what they're doing is taking pieces of information about today's world, whether that's from news articles, whether that's about startups or new products or new services being created, things that are happening in society, things that are happening in government, using those pieces of information to bring about what we call signals of change. So those are early signals of change, and collectively bring those together to understand what is the big change that might result out of all of these little changes that are happening today. So really that discipline is not about predicting the future so you can be quote less uncertain. It's more about looking at possible futures that may arise from all these signals so that you can better plan, better prepare for uncertainty. So, from that discipline, what we did is we read through. I mean, a lot of companies right now are really dealing with a lot of uncertainty, right? Irrespective of whatever industry you're in, there's lots of uncertainty ahead. And that uncertainty and the path forward is changing kind of almost daily, right?
Right.
And so for us, we thought, okay, maybe this is really an opportunity to shine a spotlight on this discipline that doesn't necessarily get as much airtime in the corporate boardrooms because it is really a unique discipline. So while everyone was sort of responding to the change around them in their respective industries, we thought let's keep our head kind of up and industry agnostic and looking forward to see where we can catch these signals of change. So with some members of our team, we collected, I think, close to 200 different signals. And some of the signals were very kind of retail focused because some of our clients were asking for help in the retail space. And some of them are financial services focused for the same reason. But a lot of it is at a very high level, what might these changes mean as a consumer? What might these changes mean as a citizen?
What do you see the biggest challenge for someone who currently maybe internally working as innovation lead? Um, if you don't mind, share your thoughts
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah, we do work with a lot of in-house innovation leads, like director of innovation at a certain company or whatever the title might be. Yeah, absolutely. So that title has always been an interesting challenge for me. I think, innovation in a corporate context is sort of not a not a deeply entrenched discipline. It's not like it's been around for decades and decades. It's kind of like a newly coined term. And a lot of these groups have been stood up for probably less than 10 years. And then you look to now in the time of COVID, I think it's going to be even tougher to demonstrate if you've had challenges as a director of innovation, for instance, even tougher to demonstrate success because there's that much more pressure on doing something new because there's
That's right.
change everywhere, doing something quickly because time is of the essence right now, doing something within a tight budget because capital is shrinking.
For
So
sure.
all of these challenges kind of put additional constraints on that role, let's say, and on that group. And I think that this will be an interesting time to see the ingenuity of those people and those teams, that talent, the different disciplines that they can use, that more iterative model to be able to come up with new ideas, test them. And frankly, if you do it early, test and iterate early enough, chuck out the idea if it doesn't seem to work without too much capital investment.
Where you think is going to be most critical areas for, I guess, innovation leads to focus on in the next couple months or next year? Because as we all see, the external environment has been evolving. And
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, especially at the time, and as you mentioned, there's a market uncertainty, but there's still
Hmm.
kind of a continuous pressure coming from competitors because everybody's
Yeah.
come up with new strategy and revamping the business model. So I guess from innovation consultancy perspective, and what advice would you like to provide to someone who's kind of in the process of thinking about the next best action?
Yeah. I really firmly believe that it's important at this point, more so than ever, to be as close to your end user, to your consumer, to your patients, to your constituents as possible. If you can figure out ways to design research that can be done quickly, that can be done efficiently, because their experience and how that's changed and their perceptions and their challenges and the world around them, how that's changed, that's ultimately what you need to be most mindful of in order to make whatever your business offering, product, service a success. If it's no longer relevant, you have to understand how, because you have to kind of understand how the lives of those end users have changed, and pivot your product or service according. So I think, we hear the term human centered design a lot, but I think in your own way, in your own efficient, quick, not necessarily cutting corners, but in your own way to find a method to understand, really internalize what's happening to those users, to those people as humans, so that you can make the adjustments for what you're bringing to them as quickly as possible.
Let's talk about kind of how the external environment going to affect on the mentality of individuals. And we went through waves of a capital expansion in the past few years, with more than a dozen of incubators being built and funds and investment made for even in-house innovations. So now
Hmm.
we're at a very different time with capital contraction and social political uncertainty and also the fear of the new normal. So
Hmm.
how can companies keep up with innovation when they're constantly worried about cost? And I think as you mentioned earlier, there's definitely the concerns about are we spending the money in the right way.
Yeah.
So where this kind of risk aversion mentality hurt us in the longer run?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question because I think there's an aspect of this risk aversion mentality that you mentioned that is very much finance driven. There are certain processes, regulations in place in order to protect us from certain risks as it relates to how we kind of allocate funds, but also in terms of innovation, of course. But there's also, for me and for a lot of, I think, innovators, an aspect of a philosophy to it. And so I think about how companies have allocated funding for different innovation projects in the past. And I think a lot of times what we've heard from our clients is, that budget had been allocated at the beginning of the year and you have the rest of the year to use it. But if change comes about in the middle of the year, it's very difficult for the finance engine to pivot in order to reallocate or change priorities in the middle of the year. And so what I would love to see is in the future, if that the past capital expansion periods will change into new ways of thinking about budget allocations so that you're doing things in a more iterative way. Like if your innovation teams in particular are looking to be more iterative and test and iterate and move things to the side if they don't happen to work, then maybe there's a new way to be risk averse from a financial standpoint for that enterprise for those specific projects.
On the other hand, maybe from leadership perspective, and I think it's important to also have the psychological safety for people who are
Oh,
working
for sure.
for innovation, right? It is true. Yes, everything has to go through physical plannings, but then when change happens, it should be a different kind of mechanism to kick it off,
Yeah, sure.
enable kind of continuity, especially in a lot of R&Ds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So would you like to maybe share a bit on the research you are currently working on and
Sure.
how we can manage in burnout? Because I think it's probably one of the most
Yeah.
important topic on a lot of top of mind of HR professionals, because we do want people to be well at the same time, of
Yes.
course, being productive. But
Yeah.
physical and mental well-being has been more important than ever.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, we are doing a piece of research right now that I'm very excited about. That will be geared primarily towards CHROs. And so what we've noticed in a lot of enterprises had recently revamped their benefits programs to include mental health and mental well-being, and burnout in and of itself had been discussed prior to COVID, right? But burnout in this context has an entirely different sort of meaning. And so I think among the many, many things that HR professionals are having to grapple with at constant change in their kind of profession, one of these is also this aspect of burnout. I think you have some people who are burnt out because, like I said, they have little ones at home or partners at home, and that there's a very active space of the home now being the office, and so you can't go home and leave the office
Correct.
behind because it's the same place. Other people who are alone are feeling loneliness and depression, and that actually also impacts their ability to be productive but also to be well. And so what we talked about is this notion of what being well or holistic well-being or being well means to different people has actually changed in this context of self-isolation. And so from an HR standpoint, how do you understand those different contexts and circumstances in an effort to create programs and supports that's meeting people where they are and what they need?
Kareen, in your report, you mentioned the needs for hygiene and social distancing suggests a movement to space and that where cleanness and emptiness out in the open, which while offering a new kind of intimacy. I find this
Mhm.
quite interesting. So, what do you think of this new kind of intimacy? New kind of intimacy would be like? If you can share your thoughts on
Yeah.
how to look at that, how to define that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. It's one thing that I think it has different sort of aspects to it. The thing that we had noticed around this theme of the empty aesthetic was, from our standpoint, we had noticed that in our research there was a lot of brands being very kind of outwardly focused and communicating what hygiene measures they've put in place, what aspects of their in-store experience that they've changed. And so I think, creating bonds in this kind of new aesthetic context where everything needs to look and be perceived as super clean and super hygienic means a lot of different changes to the consumer experience in stores, to how we kind of experience space at home and even beyond that, and also how we kind of create, in a way, intimacy or bonds in the workplace as well. From a consumer standpoint, it's interesting because you had stores before where, I don't know about you, but you would go in and there's like a DJ playing in the back and there's a coffee shop and you can sit there and you can chill out for a little while and maybe you can buy a t-shirt on your way out, but you don't necessarily have to. It was more about experiencing the brand and what the brand values are and what it stands for. In the today's context, of course, that sort of hanging about the store doesn't really exist anymore. If anything, we've gone all the way to the other end where few people can be in the store at the same time and we all have to follow certain hygienic rules. And so how you create experiences where consumers can connect with the brand is sort of eroded, and so the brands need to find new ways to create that and then to connect with their consumers in that context. So that'll be an interesting way to see how that evolves. I think in terms of the intimacy, it's this luxury of space. And so brands or spaces, places that are very expansive, that are maybe outdoors, that can allow for more people there at the same time, will be maybe perceived at this as this new kind of luxury, because there's less concern for hygienic issues or spread of disease in that context, right? And similarly for people who live in larger spaces.
Absolutely.
From Yeah, from a you were also asking, I think from an employee standpoint, this connections and not so much intimacy, I guess, but it's more about finding connections with your employees. I think that's really going to change a lot as well. You don't have an office space to go into. You can't kind of visit, chat with colleagues and so forth. Your boss can't walk about and see how everyone's feeling and doing that day.
So can you share some tips on how to make like social bonding possible and in a way of stimulating interactions and communication? That is kind of important to the birth of new ideas, right? Because we like the randomness when we bump each other in
Yeah,
coffee rooms and just talk about new ideas, but we don't have that.
totally. It's so true. I was actually just chatting with a friend of mine who's an anthropologist yesterday evening, and she was saying, I think what I miss most is that feeling of happenstance, like we can't just go out for a walk or on our way to work, bump into a friend that we haven't seen in a long time, and that sparks some kind of new thing, that happenstance doesn't really happen anymore. And so I thought that was a really interesting kind of observation. I think it's going to be tough. I think how we collaborate in a corporate context, it can adapt. And we at Faculty of Change, we've actually just done a working session entirely virtually a couple of weeks ago with a retail client of ours. And it's tough because, while we might be used to it because we're used to remote work, virtually all of our faculty is remote and working from all over the world. Our clients may not necessarily be used to it. They might have a culture of getting into a boardroom, and chatting it out. And so it's needing to be mindful of that, but also at the end of the day, you have to find new ways to collaborate. And what I've noticed, there's really cool new digital tools that enable discussions, that enable whiteboarding online, that enable kind of organizing these kinds of activities that we would normally run during a workshop, but making them more virtually organized, which has been great. So I think that kind of evolution will continue by necessity.
Absolutely, and I think how we can simulate the environmentals we are working together while we're physically
Mm,
isolated. I read about again one of my favorite authors, Adam Grant, and he actually comments on sometimes a good way of simulating the sense of belonging is by digitally, like making people maybe like asking everybody to work approximately the same time zone, right? And then at
mm,
least you can see people kind of on the chat on Slack and popping up, oh, someone's actually working there at
yeah.
the same.
hmm I think there's also that actually makes a lot of sense. It would be cool to see a virtual space that you can kind of pop into and see your colleagues working. I think that could be very interesting. I think also tough when you have, little ones at home, or a partner who's also on conference calls in a small space. All that kind of gets in the way of that. And so if you can find ways to connect with colleagues, even though you have all that stuff happening around you, would be really ingenious. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's thinking about, the digital first employee experience. I think for a long time, the employee experience has been determined by a place you go into. And so it's that shift from going to work to signing into work. And
Hmm.
then, and as consumers of, different brands, groceries, and, drugstores and whatever, we're sort of maybe used to having that digital experience in our daily life, depending on how much adoption you yourself have kind of allowed in your shopping habits and so forth. But from an employee standpoint, your employee experience has never really been digitally enabled, at least not from end to end. Right now you're thinking about HR professionals have to think about how they recruit, how they hire, how they onboard, how the day to day works, how promotions happen, how firing happens. Like all of that has to be now a seamless end-to-end digital experience. So how you connect employees to one another, create that office culture, create that vibe, that collaboration space, it changes a lot. Tools can come up to be able to do that, but I think beyond that, a lot of employers will need to think about creating that intimacy or those bonds between employees as like all of that also the collective culture. not just the individual experience of the employee needs to be translated into the online realm. So how do you create experiences for the entire employee constituency as opposed to the individual employee constituency, like onboarding, training, etc.? That's relatively easy. It's the it's the collective, it's the ability to bond all those people that's going to be really interesting, I think, going forward.
Right. I really like the way you talk about the digital first, and I think we mentioned that a lot in the past few years. But I think this COVID-19 is really kind of disrupt the normal norms, and we have no choice but to accelerate digital in, I guess, both consumer
Yeah.
facing from as well as kind of a team base. Past couple months, especially looking at social commerce in Asia, in China particularly, that's grows exponentially. Right? People is
Yeah.
looking at astonishing sales number, and that's extremely interesting.
Yeah.
And now people are trying to create this co-shopping space. Through streamings, and they can see each other's, and they can chat about, oh, how do you like this, how do you like this product or not, right? And that just kind of creating a new intimacy, which is beyond kind of physical location. So I found out
Totally.
that is really interesting, and I think another part um, is also changing the culture a little bit, and just share with you. And I think
Hmm.
I talked to a lot of friends who are still working Asia. They told me, checking
Hmm.
in, especially signing out, going to work physically. This is
Hmm.
really important. That you cannot like FaceTime, right? So
Mm.
the value of FaceTime. So now because of in the
Literal
past
FaceTime.
literal FaceTime,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I think in the past few months, and that's impossible, but I still need to make sure the productivity is up.
Yeah.
So there's a new kind of wave of adoption of Zooms and Skype, just making sure there's a digital capability enabling everybody to still work productively.
Hmm.
So I think that is a very interesting thing to happen. Obviously, I'm not saying COVID-19 is a good thing, and I think it's a
Yeah,
horrible thing happened to us,
of course.
at
Yeah.
least, and I feel like there's a whole bunch of innovation happening in the space. At least there's a silver lining of we are moving forward.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I totally agree. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this conversation. I think that's probably the end of this,
Yeah.
and then
Thank you so much for inviting me. This was lots of fun. Yeah.
yeah.